Britain suffers a series of crises of defense in the 4th century. From the 350s, a series of raiding takes place in Britain. It's not conquest, but raids of opportunity. They come in, take stuff, and leave. The invaders include the Scoti, who live in Ireland at this time, the Picts to the north, and the Saxons from the Low Countries. They use moments of Roman internal turmoil to raid. Somewhere around 410, Rome fails in Britain. After 410, a sub-Roman culture continues in the west of the island and Wales. In 450, Anglo-Saxon cemeteries sprout up in the east of the island. A shift occurs in the material culture in that area. It is more closely related to the Angles and Saxons culture from Denmark and northern Germany. The change to an Anglo-Saxon culture in the east of the island is relatively sudden. To see an example of this, let's look at two cemeteries, Queenford and Baronsfield. Queenford is a typical Roman cemetery, orderly, and everyone is wearing hobnail boots, as was the custom in Roman Britain at the time. The cemetery stopped being used around 410. Baronsfield, or from around 40 years later, is much more closely related to the cemeteries across the water in Saxony. Some people are buried with grave goods such as jewelry or animals. Nobody is wearing hobnail boots, and it is not uncommon to see that someone has met a grisly end. There were many more violent deaths in Anglo-Saxon Britain than there were in Roman Britain. But why this sudden change But these people didn't just turn up there. We can read in Gildas's work De Excidio that these people really came around 380. But where were they for 70 years? Why did their culture not appear until 450? Well, it's actually rather sad, at least if you're a huge fan of Rome, that is. You see, these Angles and Saxons chose to reclaim an identity, a family ancestral identity that they used to have. Because at this time, Rome was going through a change. You see, Rome was a cultural identity as much as it was an economic and geographic one. In the year 400, if someone wanted to fit in and be important, they had to be Roman. Rome had a monopoly on identity at this time. To be Roman meant being cultured, it meant being powerful, and most importantly, it meant fitting in. When Rome began its great failure through the 400s and the Western Empire fell into chaos, it was no longer advantageous to be Roman. To think of oneself as Roman no longer meant being cultured and in charge. It meant siding with a society that was going through emperors every few months. It meant siding with a society being carved apart by strong generals who took advantage of a failing state to get pieces of land for themselves. To be Roman was to be a loser. It was at this time that a lot of the children and grandchildren of immigrants reclaimed their ancestral identity. They re-became Saxons or Angles, and let's not leave out the rest of the empire. People all over chose to become something different from what they had grown up knowing. And this change happened by all types of Romans, even those who may not have had barbarian blood in them at all. They chose to claim tribal origins because it was advantageous for them, just like at one point their ancestors chose to be Roman because it was advantageous to them. To be a Goth, or a Frank, or a Burgundian was to be strong, it was to be free and wild, and most importantly, it was to be no longer Roman. The Angles and Saxons were already in Britain, they just decided to reclaim a culture that they had suppressed to fit in. With Rome gone, they no longer needed to fit in.